Heyo, so this is going to be a demo talking about how I use brushes when addressing speed painting and how I go about blocking in basic elements such as colors, values, and overall shapes with speed painting and trying to get it in quickly and efficiently. The first thing I'm going to go over is brushes and how I use them and what they're kind of meant to be for, and then I'm going to do some demos where I kind of go over and paint from some references. You can kind of see how I block it in. So the first thing about brushes that I want to address is the utilities of different groups of brushes. The brushes I'm going to be using are on the left side here, but they're also scribbled out on this canvas for you with some sampling so you can see how they kind of flow and look. They're roughly aligned row by row with how it is on the organization here. So the first thing I want to do is kind of break down what each set of brushes is for. All the brushes here are labeled in their respective groups and what I use them for, although many of the brushes can be used for multiple things. All the ones highlighted with a pink sticker are made by other artists. They're not brushes that I made myself. Usually they've been at least moderately modified from the original though. Such as ones from Shiyun Kim up here, ones from Kyle T. Weber, ones from Wutha, ones from Devin Corwin, etc. These are brushes that you have to pay for, so I can't really offer these in a brush pack that I put out, but you can make equivalent brushes, and as you can see in each category there are other brushes pretty much that can do similar things. Firstly, we have inking brushes up in the top left here. They're pretty self-explanatory. Most people who've done inking before are familiar with what kinds of inking brushes they like or don't like. We have ones that kind of skip out and become very jittery at low pressures and low opacities. We have ones that have some translucency or transparency enabled, and then we have ones that are kind of traditional textured thick and thin inkers. We also have brushes I use for thumbnailing, which are generally very graphic, simple, and can go from thick to thin relatively easily. We then have a couple different types of texture brushes, namely 3. The first category I've labeled Texture 1, the second is labeled Texture 2, and the third is labeled Roughness. Roughness are the main ones I'm going to be using and that I use most of the time. But these other type of texture brushes I'll go over in a second what they're actually used for. The next category is rendering, so these are brushes that have a lot of smoothness, different types of opacity variants, and can go from low transparency to high transparency, and generally speaking don't have a huge amount of size variation from pen pressure. It's mostly just opacity. That's for kind of giving us those smooth transitions you can see in here. And then we have brushes for blocking. These are going to be the main brushes I use early on when blocking a painting. They're simple, graphic, and effective. So in order to kind of address why I'm going to approach using painting using these brushes, I want to kind of lay out the basic rules I follow with any kind of painting, which is going from simple shapes to complex shapes, and hard edges to soft edges. Going from simple shapes to complex shapes means that you're making sure your graphic read is clean, simple, and effective initially, and then where there's some variation such as textures, hairs, lots of little fiddly things, spiky things, etc., that those are added secondarily later, and the shapes become more complex only once the initial composition and shape read is clear. The next is going from hard edges to soft edges. My rule about edges and defining edges or planes of something are that as long as you start with a hard edge, you'll be able to soften it later into a soft edge. Starting with soft edges and hardening it is a lot more work than softening a hard edge that you already decided on. Additionally, if you have hard edges and you're using hard brush strokes that are clean and graphic, it's forcing you to make a more clear decision about the exact color, shape, and sort of feeling and texture of that stroke, and what that needs to be to read well in and of itself without getting blended out into being something soft and subtle. If it works in a more drastic setting, it will definitely work when it's more subtle as well. Regarding texture brushes, these are kind of complicated in that these brushes, the ones by Kyle T. Weber, as you can see, have very complex aggressive texturing on them. This texturing is really good in images that are exclusively using brushes that have similarly aggressive texturing. If you start intermixing them heavily with brushes like these down here for blocking that are very simple and graphic, you'll actually end up making paintings that often look unfinished because the level of detail and texture density in different areas is so drastically different that it will look incomplete. So often if you're using aggressively textured brushes like this, the main reason why they will look weird when a lot of people use them when they don't know how to use them is they don't realize that the whole image needs to be just as dense and complexly and similarly textured to these in order to feel equally finished, which is why high density kind of complex brushes like this often look kind of odd, especially if you don't use them consistently and practice with them, because they'll look out of place. These textures down here are kind of basic. The reason why they're their own category is that they're kind of specific utility. These are the types of brushes that I use when doing a very specific sort of feel to a texture. Often when you're in a later part of a speed painting after a lot of the basics have been put down already, these are going to be kind of adding some nuance to surface detailing and the feel and flow of different surface qualities that are a little more complex. For example, this one by Ahmed Aldori is a really good wood brush for wood grainy type textures, but it's not necessarily going to really work super well for a grass texture necessarily, right? Or it might not work super well for, say, a cloth texture that's meant to be something silky. This just really won't fit it and won't cut it super well. So it's really a really nice texture brush, but it's not great for every utility. It's not super applicable in every situation, and again, you're going to somewhat run into the problem that you have up here, where the level of detailing in this texture is quite high, so everything else needs to be complementary, and in a speed paint you often don't have time to do that. These roughness brushes are the main texture brushes I use because they accomplish the three kind of main textures that I tend to see in things. Things that are grainy, so there's detail in the texture, but it's kind of low to the surface level. Things that have a lot of texture, so like foliage, fur, cracks, things that have a lot of variance and deep variance in the texture, and things that are kind of intermediate, so things like leather or other materials where there's shallow but still notably dense texture variance in the surface. They're not as deep and haptic as these, and they're definitely more defined and less staticky or gravelly than these types of textures. But these main three can serve to do a lot of different purposes and work in a lot of different types of paintings. The main things I wanted to kind of cover as well before I move on regarding brushes and how I use them is there's a few functions that are somewhat notable that a lot of people don't seem to be very familiar with Photoshop brushes, and one of them is the wet edges function. The wet edges function on a brush is found here. I can toggle it on and off. So without wet edges, this is an opaque brush. With wet edges, what Photoshop is actually doing is creating a small opaque border around your stroke that is roughly the full opacity color that you've selected, and it's setting the base value or the base opacity of the brush stroke that you're doing down to around 40 something percent, usually around 41. Photoshop's a little inconsistent with this and it'll depend on the brush, but it's approximately 41 to 45% opacity by default. One of the reasons this is actually a pretty useful function is if you apply it to an already hard-edged brush, it doesn't affect the brush performance too much, and it has the added bonus of being lower opacity without you having to mess with the opacity while you're painting, which sometimes can be kind of a beneficial tool. Just to have a brush that's automatically going to be lower opacity, and you're going to have to work with that. It is something you're going to need to accommodate for, though, when you're picking colors, for example, or layering. But it is quite a nice feature that's in there. Another feature that I kind of not necessarily a feature, but a kind of performance thing that I prefer with my brushes is that, as you can see, most of them have a hard edge, right? And that's because I'm going from hard edge to soft edge. But what does that actually mean in practice? How are we going to achieve that? You know, if all of our brushes are very hard edged and graphic, how are we going to get some of those softer edges without getting super niddly into rendering? The main answer is going to be through smudgers and through the eraser. So here I have my square brush, trusty square brush, can never go wrong with it, right? Does these nice hard strokes, and then oftentimes if I need to soften an edge, I'm going to use a smudger or blender, I have a lot of different types of blenders. This is my favorite one to use because it, at low pressure, has this scattered, grainy texture to it, and at high pressure is much more of a, and of course with the brush tilt, it has a lot more of a soft, smoothing effect to the edge. And this way, along with a soft eraser, we can create some variance in edges without messing with our brushes or having to switch to a softer brush. So we'll get some variety while still maintaining some of that graphic read and the strength of that initial stroke. And before we move on as well, I did want to mention that, of course, different brushes are just going to not be very applicable in different situations. And for certain things, some brushes that are really hard-edged are very beneficial, and for some, they are not. It depends on what you're rendering, but generally speaking, bolder, stronger strokes that are well designed initially are going to be more useful and effective than ones that are soft and kind of mushy. So next we're going to move into some demos. The demos we're going to be doing today are based on these two images, one of a beautiful, lovely lizard, and one of someone in some ceremonial attire of Theam in India. A very exciting, fun wardrobe. And both of these studies are going to be about 25 to 30 minutes, mostly because I want there to be enough time for us to kind of get into some of the detailing and for some layering to actually take place. So we're going to start with our lizard here, our lizard friend. Here I've already got a canvas blocked in with a basic color. I don't really like this color. I think it's I just picked a random kind of yellow-brown. It's pretty close to the image, but not quite what I want. So when I'm blocking in the background like this, because it's out of focus, normally I would start with a hard brush right off the bat, but because it's out of focus and we're going to want to maintain the feeling of being out of focus on this, we're going to go in and quickly block in some softness to this plane back here. So I'm just going to try to get the colors accurate, because I care quite a bit about color. Color is something I focus on a lot in my studies, and it's not necessarily something everyone is going to want to focus on nearly as much as I do. But the reason why, typically, I tend to focus so much on color is that I find that color is a pretty key component to discerning a kind of mood to an image and an overall feel to it. Especially when it comes to things like nature or any kind of overall scene versus kind of an independent character rendering. Character renderings kind of devoid of context of an environment are fine. I don't really have any problems with them. They just they have different requirements, right, for what you're going to need to capture to effectively get across the feeling of the image. I also have noticed here that there's a little bit of dark right here. So this is kind of some general blocking in. I just wanted to get a sense of the environment and kind of the gradients we're working with back here, so that when I place my lizard down, he doesn't feel super out of place or out of context, and that he has, more importantly, an environment that has the right kind of values and colors that affect the lighting that is on him, which is very important. The environment's sort of colors, and you'll see I make mistakes every now and then and just redo it, it's no big deal. A lot of speed painting is also just going to be like, you want to make strokes that are effective and accurate. So if they're not doing that, then you just redo it, until it's correct. That's just kind of the way it is most of the time. Sometimes it takes you a lot of tries to get a color. That's okay. So I think this is pretty close. I really like to move this section here. Ah, okay. Sorry, I switched the language on my keyboard. I was wondering why the commands weren't working. But anyway, you're going to want to kind of make sure that this is roughly okay as your starting point. And this, of course, gets quite dark behind his head. Alright, I think this background is okay. We've got a lot of the basic colors in there, and you'll notice I didn't really color pick from the image, and that's fine. If you need to color pick because you can't get those colors down, then do that initially. But it really pays, in my opinion, to practice getting good at being able to tell what colors you're looking at. Like I found that is I know that hand is at the wrong angle. But that's very useful. Okay, so we now have a nice solid lizard selection. I'm going to go ahead and put in nice kind of deep green. I actually want it to be a little more saturated than that because our boy is very saturated. So we're going to lock this layer. It's fine. And now this selection isn't perfect, but it's serviceable for now. So what I'm going to want to do is go ahead and get my kind of nice square brush that I love so much and kind of show off what it's good at. It's good at blocking. So right now, I don't really care about the feeling of my strokes. What I do care about is if they're feeling accurate to the colors and the values. And if they're not, what can I do to alleviate that? I found that working this way, where you're oversimplifying at the beginning and really going for very basic shape reads, it's very helpful later on. It stops you from focusing on little nitty-gritty things that don't really matter and gets you thinking about what does really matter, which is your values and your forms. And you can also, if you have it set up for your Photoshop, kind of flick to your different modes and see kind of what is up, if there's any areas that are kind of causing some trouble. I think right now you're getting kind of a good block in here. As I was saying before, tend to exaggerate colors and edges because I just find that to be more effective. If your colors are a little much, who cares? Also notice that his belly and down here is a bit cooler than the rest of his body. And that's mostly because the light on him from above is warm and the reflected light below him is a bit cooler. You're seeing also some of that bright yellow reflected as well. So some of the reflected light is warm because it's reflecting the ambient cool light, but some of it is reflecting off his skin back onto him, and some of that's going to come across a little cooler. That's something to take note of. So now we have a pretty simple, effective block-in. I'm also going to block in this rock he's sitting on. Normally I would use a lasso, but I'm feeling a bit lazy with it. So it's going to be kind of rough and fast. I want to make sure I get some of these values and colors right as well, because they're going to define this area later on. Also notice that our lizard is a little low in the frame, so we're going to raise him up. We're also going to chop off some of this gunk down here, because it's getting in the way. And we're not being too careful about this, and that's perfectly fine. Okay, so we've got a pretty good lizard in now. We're approximately 10 minutes in. We've got something relatively legible, right? We're missing a lot of the nuance of his face and some of these transition areas, but what's important is that we have a general read right now that's pretty good. And I'm also noticing that this background back here is just desaturated in a way that I don't like. So I'm going to go ahead and go into overlay and get some yellow back in here. You can adjust the settings of the brush itself in Photoshop without having to go to different layer settings or anything like that, and it's very helpful. If you're working on one layer, you don't feel like making a whole bunch of random layers. Okay. Now that we have some of this hard stuff locked in, we can start adding in some basic texturing. And I'm not going to worry too much about a lot of these details. Now I'm going to also start applying some of these textured brushes. Some of these more flamboyant textured brushes are going to be very beneficial for us moving forward, because they're going to let us do a lot of fun things. Before we get too excited about that, I think I want to divide the lizard again from the rock in terms of our selection. Because I think it'll be better for us to lock the lizard so we don't have to worry too much about how much stuff is blending. And I needed to look at the reference on my other screen for a second and kind of think about what I was going to do. I'm going to start by softening some of this transition down here with a brush that I think is quite good for that, which is this textured rough kind of brush. And one of the advantages is of going kind of silly with some of your color blocks like this is that you can really start to use the brushes, the colors you've kind of already made, I should say, and start mixing them together very quickly. And for a lot of these spines, I just want to get the indication of it. I'm not super interested right now in terms of where we're at detail-wise. Alrighty. So that's feeling pretty alright. So let's go ahead. Start using some of my favorite brushes here to kind of get some of this variation on the neck. I think this is capturing this reflection in my eyes is quite important to capturing kind of the lighting feel of the situation. And I think capturing the sense of the light is pretty important for capturing the kind of feel of the scene, the mood of it. So right now, we've got a pretty similar read, but we're missing a lot of our key highlights from this lower area here. I also want to go ahead and fill in some of this here. Oops, wrong layer. It's fine. Sometimes I mix up my layers. Normally I would label all of them, but that is not necessary for a speed paint. Normally I barely name one, so we're not doing that. Selections are also a really good way to get the control of a certain area or shape of a brushstroke without sacrificing key components of your brush. So it's good to kind of go back and forth a little bit. Oops, forgot to unlock there. And kind of see how you could sort of rework and improve a selection or an area, even with the same brush, but just by kind of locking it so that you're not losing information that you've made. So now we're at about the 20-minute mark out of 30 on this one. And the read on it, it's reading like a lizard, in my opinion. In my humble opinion. But it's not necessarily all we're here to do. I'd also like to get rid of this under here, because it is distracting me from where the hand is, so I can't make good selections up here. One key area that I think we need to really make sure we address well is this hand. I'm going to try to make this a decent selection. We're going to softly kind of lay in so that the fingers have some hardness to them, some bulk to them. And now we're also going to kind of get some of this texture in there. Because we need it to kind of merge in with how yellow the light gets up here compared to lower on the body. As you can see, it gets much lighter and desaturated compared to up here on this fin, where things are very very light. One key way that's really easy to do that, or to adjust things like a hue discrepancy, is to just go ahead and frankly set your brush to color mode. Just color it yourself. I'm going to kind of indicate some of these wrinkles, because I think the wrinkles around the neck are pretty descriptive for the kind of lizard this is, aside from the fin. I'm trying to capture key features. Really like to make sure that they are depicted well enough so that you could theoretically recognize this lizard as not just a character, but also as a species. I think that helps quite a bit. Of course, we're looking pretty messy down here in this part of the body, so I'm just going to go ahead and blend and smooth out some of this area, because I think getting that body line to read is going to be pretty important, especially given how the light is hitting his skin and reflecting upwards. That feels pretty alright. Time to unlock our layer. And of course, we're going to go clean up this selection a little bit, because we have a little bit of time here to kind of go in and make this selection a little more accurate. By accurate, I just mean to have some of that texture of some of the fins and things like that. kind of actually in there, so it feels a little less kind of like a lasso selection. Just a little bit more organic. We're going to go ahead and also get some texture up in here on this tail, feeling a little flat there. Because as you can see, kind of, it doesn't take too much to kind of get things to feel pretty alright in terms of texture, so long as you really make sure that your general value and color choices were okay. Also kind of knocking back some of these frills because they were grabbing too much attention. And now I think we're getting somewhere a little nicer. But a lot of these brushes can be used in many different ways. I think each of them has a distinct feel to them. It's just a matter of the feel of the texture you're trying to capture. And how you're going about it. As you can see, this spot on his chin here that's got a bit of blue in it, if we add too much blue, it'll actually stop looking blue. It's actually gray in the image, or at least it's pretty gray. We went and color picked it. And this section up here is just a pretty desaturated yellow. So already with a pretty simple process, we're kind of getting where we want to be on this at a relatively fast pace. So we're about done on this, pretty much. We will be done in about 2 minutes. That's how long we have left on this speed paint. Going a little slower than normal, given that I'm recording and talking and trying to make sure I'm covering things as I work. But one thing we're going to focus on getting in now is the eye. Because I think the orange eye on this reference is quite a discerning feature for the lizard. And of course add some texture to this fun little rock down here. One thing I did not capture, now that I'm stopping my focusing on the lizard, which I ought to have done earlier, is that really, this spot on the rock by his foot, where we're seeing that light source, is a pretty important detail of this reference, in my opinion. I think it really defines a lot of the lighting, and I think it's quite a useful thing to kind of look at. So I'm going to take an extra minute or so just quickly lay in this light. And get some of these darks around it so that it pops. Because I think it's pretty important. I've also missed this back limb of the lizard, but I honestly don't think it helped that much. To kind of discern that it's a lizard. I didn't think it was particularly necessary, clearly. But we can go ahead and block it in as well while we're here. Though not that sloppily. And we don't want to soften that edge, because that's part of the lizard's foot. So, how did we do? Not bad. Not bad for a quick block-in, quick speed paint. If I were to be able to continue this longer, now that we've stopped officially, what parts are lacking? Well, the head feels unresolved compared to the body. I spent a lot of time in this middle section here because honestly I found that this part of the anatomy was the most interesting to capture. We've kind of lacked on a lot of the contrast and shape definition of these areas, so they feel a bit unresolved compared to the rest. And that's going to be something that in a longer speed paint, for example, I'd go in and kind of cut some of this and make sure that these areas are more fully addressed. But in general, right, simple, effective use of the brushes, and the textures feel moderately consistent. None of the textures are super aggressive or screaming over others. And certainly, you know, areas like, say, this, you'd want to kind of, sort of start filling in to get some of this kind of detailing of the head and how these folds interact. And so if I had a lot more time, I would start doing some of that. Well, we don't right now, and that's okay. We're going over and doing quick studies. So, overall value read, pretty good. Could be better. But it overall has a general similar feeling to the light that we see in this one, which was important for what I wanted to capture. And I feel like the overall color palette's very similar, although mine is a bit more yellow and orange based, because I wanted it to feel kind of warm. So thanks, Lizzie. We're done with you for now. Now we're on to another fun kind of composition. This big friend here. This is going to be a bit of a challenge. As you can see, there's a lot of detail to go through and to kind of start working in. So I'm going to kind of rein myself in advance and say that the background characters are going to be loose. And the foliage on the top I can't get too distracted by because it does look very fun to paint, but I'm not going to be able to get to it very much if I want this character to have a lot of definition to him. So we're going to kind of, in this one, very quickly block the whole thing in as much as I can with the square brush to make sure that we have it fully in as much as we can, and then we'll start on refining afterwards, only after that. This is going to be another 20 to 30 minutes. It really depends on how quickly I can get it done. So let's start up. with our blocking. I like this general gray color I have. I think it's pretty close to the ground color. It's not too far off, so that's very useful. I'd like to get some of these colors in. I'm also kind of going in really quickly and defining some of this stuff, because I don't think later on I have much time. Considering this is going to be a little shorter than the previous one, I don't think I'll have enough time to really add more definition to this. So I'm going to try to block it in a way that feels coherent in and of itself. So we're trying to find some of these colors. I think this is pretty close. A little redder. We'll have pretty much that color. Frankly, for some of these roofs, I don't particularly care. So now that we have this section kind of blocked out, I'm going to go ahead and approach the sky how I normally would, which is I put in the sky color, and then block in some of the major leaves. Again, we're going to make sure that I don't get too overboard on this, because I actually quite like rendering leaves and forests and things. We want to keep this loose, because we're not really going to have time to address this later. And we're not actually going necessarily to copy the exact leaves here, because that takes a really long time, and it's not really very rewarding in terms of what accuracy, like it doesn't feel a whole lot better than, say, making up your own leaves. It really doesn't. It feels about the same in terms of how like accurate or realistic the leaves are gonna feel. So now I'm going to switch my brush to multiply. Switch back to normal. And sort of select areas where I think there's going to be some capability for noise. Kind of fill it in. That's one of the strengths of these brushes, or brushes like this one, where they're generating a lot of noise for you, and you don't need to worry too much about getting too accurate. Of course, again, we're not worrying too much about a lot of these details. We are going to give some definition, but not a lot. This brush also has a little bit of color color hue jitter, so it's going to add some variety even though our strokes are pretty flat. I think that texture there is quite distracting. So I'm going to kind of leave it like this, and I think this background will do pretty well. I think it'll do nicely enough. We are approximately 10 minutes in. So we're going to, at least assuming I'm reading my clock correctly, so we need to get going on this figure, huh? I am going to carefully, though, make sure the temperature of my background is adequately cool. I did that on the incorrect layer, I did it on his layer. So let's go ahead and get to blocking in this friend here. So I don't really love this selection. I think it's passable. Going to transform the selection just to be a little more accurate. Oops, that's not correct. Sometimes getting your selection to be accurate takes a hot minute. That is quite a blinding red, but that is not far off from what we want. So let's go ahead and start defining this friend. This is going to be quite an aggressive color, and so the way we utilize it and how well we actually infuse our colors and stuff is going to be pretty important here to get this red to read okay. And you actually can, even if you don't know anatomy very well, you can use this kind of a method because, frankly, we're just looking at shapes here. But anatomy will help. as per most things, the more you know the better. So I definitely wouldn't recommend avoiding learning anatomy or something like that. Let's see if that feels okay. A little darker, a little more saturated. What we need. We also want to transform the selection because I think it's a bit offset from where it needs to be. We're going to go ahead and erase this extra excess. So we're going through and making sure that these selections are accurate-ish. Because of course, it's hard to be fully accurate. You could also just lock in some stuff. The reason why I tend to use the Lasso Tool over, say, a brush much of the time while blocking is not only because the Lasso Tool generally is just going to be faster, but also because you know, sometimes depending on the size of your brush, you're going to have to cut and carve a lot to get your strokes to be accurate to what you want. Especially if you're like me and you just opt to have your brush bigger all the time. And so it's a good practice to use the Lasso Tool if you're going to cut and carve with your brush strokes. I'm thinking this is feeling okay. So I'm just going to fill around the outside here. Now this is going to be a pain in the butt to paint because we're going to have to get these nice offset and they're not quite ellipses. So that makes it a little difficult. Also just going to go ahead and draw some of these features I want to capture. Our square brush here. See how well they line up. That's looking pretty okay in terms of our general kind of lineup of features here. So it looks like our measurements were not too far off. Our lasso selection was okay. Wasn't great, wasn't perfect, we've got some error in there, but good enough for now. We've also got quite a bit of stuff to kind of consider. So now the time has come. Oh, looks like I accidentally mislabeled this brush. That's okay. We're going to go ahead and go something a bit cooler. Just kind of block in some of this stuff opaquely. And right now, because of how this reference is set up, we're going to want to probably, to make our lives a little bit easier, be smart about how we go about layering some of these patterns. These patterns are quite difficult and complex, and I want to do them some sort of justice here in my simplification. Also want to make sure that we're not getting too caught up in little details. So this concept soft brush here is pretty good for this kind of thing. I think now we can afford to turn off that layer lock we had going. Start adding in some of these saturated reds. We have in the reference here. And of course, a lot of this is going to be about layering correctly. I think the best way we can approach this top disk here is by seeing it as a singular entity that has patterns over the top, instead of seeing it as kind of a very complex form of many smaller shapes. We're just going to see it as a big form lots of decor added on afterwards. Sometimes you can go in with some texture, but most of the time you're probably not going to want to get too excited about adding texture to cloth unless the cloth really demands it. Yeah, a good airbrush can get you a long way as long as you're using the selections carefully. You're also approaching a milestone in terms of our time left on this image as well. So we're going to have to go a little faster, which means it's probably time for the hard round. Secret weapon in everyone's arsenal, although arguably less so than you would think. I'm going to turn wet edges off of this brush, so we end up with just an opaque ellipse brush. And I actually will probably put these on a new layer. But I can lock them for easier selections to go faster later, as we are short on time to get all these details in. I want to get at least a good number of these kind of circular details in, because they were what really drew me to the image in the first place. And at this point, not looking at the ref as closely, because frankly, aligning these correctly with the ref will take a long time. And in time, with a speed paint, often is not a luxury you can afford. So you will have to live with what you can do. This face being a bit rough. Unfortunately, humans look a lot at faces when we see them. Like a lot. And that often leads to us hyperfixating on it despite other interesting features being present. So faces end up needing and getting a lot more attention than they really deserve in a painted image. Like, you'll often completely ignore many other features in the image in favor of a face that your brain told you should look at, probably because it's important. And it makes sense. Human physiology sort of dictates that we need to kind of be social creatures, and you need to check the emotions and faces of your peers. But it's rather annoying as an artist, because it means you end up having to spend quite a long time on things that are not necessarily that important. Which can be very frustrating. But such is the reality, we can't really change it. This is the price you pay for having a human figure in your image, is that you do need to spend a lot of time focusing on it. Comparatively, of course. You don't necessarily just spend 10 years on it, unless it's an illustration that's super rendered, in which case you probably would want to spend a very long time on it. We're just going to kind of indicate some of these features. Get it kind of blended in. So as you can see, speed paints can get pretty frantic. I'm going to try to indicate some of the detail here. And I really like these kind of bright orange and green kind of edges here. So I'm wondering how green they actually are in the image. Probably not too green. Yeah, they're feeling about this green. We want to kind of indicate some of this detailing here so that this structure that we've constructed, this area, makes sense. And thus we have something relatively finished, and we are over time. Very unfortunate, but such is the way. If I were to spend an extra 10 minutes on this, or 5, however many, what areas are we struggling in? I think we've lost a lot of the light on the chest. So, because I feel like I've kind of not succeeded there, I'm going to go ahead and bring some light areas that I think need it. And change this color because we have a blue sky, so cool light, warm shadows. Of course, we are also lacking a little bit in the department of the ground, right? We knew we were going to kind of be missing components there. And we're missing some of the bystanders, but such is the way. So, hopefully, this simplification process makes sense. in how we're applying some of these brushes. We're using both hard and soft edged brushes to, in essence, capture some of the basic components of the image. And of course, these are shorter, and if you were to spend double the time on either of these, you could probably get something quite nicely finished in a relatively short amount of time, because both of these were only about a half hour of work. And they already have a good sense of the kind of general colors we're looking for, composition, and have rough indications of texture blocked in. On the lizard, far more so, because we were focusing in on one thing. Didn't have to spend any time on the environment, really. And on this one, it's a lot harder because the lighting is a lot flatter up in this image, so there's not a good sense of dramatic contrast to push the image without us doing extra work to kind of get those subtleties in. Especially regarding the various textures on this outfit here, because this is not a form we are used to seeing, right? This is not like a lizard where it's pretty intelligible just from the silhouette. If you saw just the silhouette of this figure, I don't know if you'd be able to identify really what it is. So we needed to make sure that it's clear that it's a figure, and clear that this is decorative head dressing and things like that, for it to be intelligible, which means we can't really cheat nearly as much on things here, like where the sort of the hand is basically like one select shape and stuff like that, because we can read that as a hand, etc. So hopefully this was informative and useful for those kind of interested in how you can quickly block things in. I'm sure with a bit of practice and using any brushes, the ones that have some similar features to some used here, could get you similar results. Otherwise, good luck painting and have fun.